Dr. Stuart Parkinson. I'm speaking to you in your role as Director for Scientists for Global Responsibility. I was wondering, can you tell me a bit about your work at Scientists for Global Responsibility and what you yourself particularly do there in your role as Director?
So my main expertise is in environmental science and particularly climate change. Um, but I've worked across a range of fields, particularly within this post, a range of science and ethics issues. So I've always also covered things like the risks of emerging technologies and the military involvement in science and technology. And the tasks I mainly carry out are research and policy relevant analysis, but also doing some campaign work. And then in this role, I also manage the organization. So there's, lots of issues around, what's involved in managing an organization, managing staff, planning projects, fundraising, and various other things.
Great, thank you. And so, what was your original subject that you studied at university?
So I studied for my bachelor's degree, I studied physics and electronic engineering. And I worked, yes, I worked for a year in industry, and I worked for an arms company. And I quickly got disillusioned with that work, mainly because of the ethical issues it involved. And when I went back to university to finish my degree, I started looking around for alternative options, and I found a PhD on climate physics. And so that's where I changed career path and went in that direction and did the PhD in climate physics and then postdoctoral work after that. And then, yes, all sorts of other things which we could talk about.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I'd like to ask you much more about your kind of the challenges and opportunities you faced throughout the course of your research. But I wondered, what were your early inspirations as a child or young adult? What drew you initially to your subject?
Well, I've always been good at numbers. I've always liked numbers, maths, physics arose out of that. I had aspirations to go into things like astrophysics and yeah, I even remember writing to NASA when I was a child and asking whether I could be an astronaut. And they said, "You're not American, so you can't do it with us." So, so yes, and yes, since found out a lot more about that and have a lot more qualms about that whole area. But I, yes, I enjoyed all the mathematical problem solving of those degree of those subjects. Look for a degree in that area. Um, Also, under the influence of my grandfather, who was an electronic engineer, he encouraged me to go into engineering because it was more applied. And so I moved in that direction. And so yes, hence the combined degree, physics and electronic engineering. And that degree arose, it was a course that was sponsored by industry, and he said, "Oh, that would be a good opportunity for you to get your foot in the door with industry." And but it was a company. One of the main things it was doing was making arms and various other military equipment. Um, and that created all sorts of ethical concerns. Initially, it was quite exciting, some of the work. I looked at, I was doing research particularly on a type of technology called image intensifiers, and these are um, clever pieces of kit that you use or are being used, are being developed and now quite widely used for seeing things in the dark. And of course, in this company, they were being used for military purposes, so they were being incorporated into night sights for rifles and enabling people, the soldiers, to shoot people in the dark. And and that sort of, yeah, that got me concerned. and I thought that's not so attractive, and then I found out while working for the company um, that they weren't only selling this equipment to the British military, they were selling it to other countries, and particularly some countries with very poor human rights records, and that was if you like, the point at which said, no, I need to look for something else. This is not ethical. This is not what I want to do with my career. This is not what I want to do with my skills. And at that time, climate change, this was in the late 1980s, the Cold War was coming to an end. At that particular time, electronic engineering, a lot of the jobs were in the arms industry, but there was also growing areas of around climate change. And my maths and physics skills were something that were transferable to a range of disciplines, and I found an environmental science PhD, and they were looking for someone with good math skills. It was mathematical modeling of the climate system, trying to understand the role of greenhouse gas emissions in warming the climate, and they were looking for someone I mean, I remember the interview with the with my PhD supervisor, and he was from an engineering background, and he said, "Well, having a degree in environmental science is all very well, but actually they're not very good at maths, and we want someone who's good at maths." And I had the background which with the strong maths, and that got me into that whole area. I did the PhD in climate science. Um, there were, a lot of interesting elements to it, but also as you find in research, a lot of obstacles. You're at the cutting edge of science, and some of the computer systems didn't work so well, and there were all sorts of elements of that. Um, and when I finished my PhD, I then looked for. Well, I was wondering whether to stay in research at all because I wanted to do more proactive activity, and I went and did voluntary work after my PhD, went traveling, and particularly went traveling in India, and got to see poverty in the developing world firsthand, and that made me want to do more work in that area. And in the end, I came back to the UK, and I thought, well, I do want to do research, but I want to do more applied research. And I got a postdoctoral research post looking at various elements of climate, the relationship between climate science and climate technology and climate policy. And so I moved more into those fields.
Fascinating. Thank you. That's a long and varied early research career. I guess I'm interested in when you were initially at university and you said it was an industry supported degree, your physics and engineering, and you have just outlined the kind of questions that were raised for you with developing some of these technologies. I wonder, were there conversations amongst your peers and also amongst your kind of this senior academics within your department around the sort of ethical tensions around developing those technologies?
Not many. I remember, I mean, when I found out about the arms exports to countries with poor human rights records, that was a colleague in industry who told me, you do know where these things are being sold, and I didn't, and he told me, and then I thought, oh, um, and he left the organizations shortly after that conversation, and I kind of thought, well, he's gone. That's Yeah, there are ways out of this.
Hmm.
He moved into a different area of work. Um, I mean, most people I spoke to didn't have ethical concerns about the work, and I said, well, it's yes, there are some people who just dismiss the concerns and say, well, it's nothing to do with me. I don't control who buys the weapons, who we sell the weapons to. I'm just doing the research. So there's a lot of ways in which people excuse themselves
Yeah.
from responsibility. And I couldn't do that. I found no, you're a key part of this. This is a key part of your work. There is a key outcome that you can see, and that's not an outcome that I want to be part of. And there are so many other things that you can apply your expertise to, and 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 there are so many issues that neglect that don't have enough people, don't have enough scientists and engineers working on them. And climate change back then, hardly anyone was working on it. And now there are a lot more people on it, a lot more industries on it. There are a lot more job opportunities now. But we are still not doing anything like enough to tackle the problem. And we are heading past the agreement, the targets in the Paris Agreement, for example, the 1.5 degree global temperature target. It's going to be exceeded very soon because we have not done enough as a society, and we as scientists and engineers haven't done enough as a profession to help change this. And we're being sucked back into a sort of Cold War with Russia, the conflict in Ukraine. We have failed to find a peaceful path away from the Cold War, which I think is a major problem. And I think that's a much wider issue. But as an engineer and a scientist, you need to look at where you are, what role you are playing, and what organizations you're supporting. And are you being part of the problem, just entrenching all the historical problems of war or pollution, or are you helping us to move away from those situations?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree. Um, I mean, you have already said this in a way, but I just wonder if I can ask it in a slightly different way. Did you, speaking kind of particularly in your undergraduate studies, did you feel that that information about the connection between the technologies you were developing was transparent, or did you feel that there were conversations that you had to have on the margins and information you had to look for proactively?
I don't think the company itself hid what it did. It said there are a range of technologies we make, and then you were assigned a placement according to all sorts of factors, including what your skills were or what your technical interests were.
Mhm.
Um, and then the ethical conversations weren't, there were no ethical conversations. Here's your placement, you will go and work in it. And then you suddenly go, well, wait a minute. This is not what I had in mind.
Mhm.
Um, there were certainly no discussions at university about ethical issues. I mean, I'm aware that later on in years after that, there were ethical courses in ethics at the university, um, that did discuss some of these issues,
Mhm.
but it was occasional and not consistent. And yes, it was done in some years and not in others. It was done for some students and not others. And the last I heard, the courses have been abandoned in that particular university. So yeah,
Mm.
and interestingly, that university now has a big research contract with BAE Systems. So
Thank you.
yes.
Um, So I guess you've spoken also about some of the challenges that you face sort of moving more into kind of climate science in terms of the lack of job opportunity, the fewer job opportunities you had at the time as it was an emerging sort of discipline. Um, were there any other challenges you faced over the course of your sort of career on these environmental and ethical issues up until the point that you are today?
Yes, I mean, I've chosen a path which looks at ethical issues in science and technology, so these issues continually arise. Um, and part of my role is to talk to people who are in the situation that I was in 20, 30 years ago, and help them navigate it. Um, so that's part of the role. At SGR, we have information on our website and resources to help guide people who want to choose a more ethical career in science and technology. We've got some resources on the website called Globally Responsible Careers in Science and Technology, which help guide people to use their skills in a way that helps tackle environmental and social problems rather than exacerbate them. So, so it has been a key part of my work. In terms of um, other issues that I encountered when I was working in academia, um, there are a number of issues that arose. The biggest one, and it continues to arise, is corporate influence on research and development, and the degree to which you do work that is sponsored by industry or has an industry partner, and they can guide the work to, okay, how can we make money out of this? And you want to go, well, actually, I would think the aim of this should be to come up with some stringent environmental safeguards and policies, and you find yourself clashing with the corporation in question. I mean, that happened with an oil company, for example, when I was working doing postdoc research at Surrey University, and that was a problem. And when we raised ethical concerns, the project was terminated, although they claimed it wasn't anything to do with that. They simply said the money had run out. We're having a change in direction. And since then, I've heard that sort of thing a lot of times, and you kind of think, yes, we know what was really happening then. And this is the situation. So often you'll find oil companies will start to invest some money in renewables, then the economic situation changes and they go, oh, well, that's no longer a priority for us, despite the fact that climate change is just getting worse and worse and worse, and we are failing to reduce emissions anything like as quickly as we need to.
Thank you. Yes, that's really striking example that you've just shared there. If it isn't too obvious a question, I wonder if you can tell me in what ways you see your work at SGR making a positive contribution to environmental and ethical causes. Or some of the
Well,
ways. I think we can see what it
yes,
does. Perhaps you can share some of the ways.
yes. I mean, there are a whole range of areas that we work on. So, for example, one of the projects we're working on at the moment is looking at the carbon footprint of the military. So that is an under-researched area of climate change, of greenhouse gas emissions accounting. It's an area where there's very poor data. The data is often hidden. For example, the carbon footprint of the military isn't well understood because of both commercial confidentiality and security restrictions, national security restrictions on things like supply chains. So access to data is much more difficult. And so even in reports like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that are the main scientific reports to UN decision-making processes, they don't cover military emissions. They're barely mentioned at all, even though there's data that indicates that they could be sizable. And in fact, we've done research and we've estimated that global military carbon footprint could be around 5.5% of global carbon emissions. So while that's a very uncertain figure, it kind of demonstrates that that's an issue to work that needs much more work on, but it's not getting much attention. It's very sensitive. Governments don't really want to talk about it, and they're having enough trouble agreeing on so many other things that this is an area that's completely neglected. So we try and do research and work with campaign groups to raise awareness of issues where things are not, where the data is poor and the issue, it does need more prominence. And yeah, we do that in climate change. For example, we also do it on peace and disarmament issues. And again, the discussions around military technologies, both existing military technologies and new technologies, is often very poor. And Britain is a country that does not like to discuss um, issues around mil militarization. Apart from how much more should we spend on the military, there's no discussion of um, should British military strategy change because we are selling weapons to human rights abusing countries around the world, or our military stance is aggressive and is fueling arms races, or we deploy weapons of mass destruction in the forms of nuclear weapons, and that's a risk to the future of civilization. If a nuclear war starts, then it's game over. And Britain, by deploying nuclear weapons, helps to create a situation where there's an existential threat to human civilization and all the ecosystems we share the planet with.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Um, my last question really is, what would you say to the young scientists, the next generation who are sort of perhaps they're finishing their degrees or they're currently studying at university now in STEM subjects, and they are wrestling with these questions that you yourself wrestled with when you were first starting out as a young professional scientist? Um, what would you, what pathway would you suggest, or what would you, what hope would you offer them for an alternative pathway?
I mean, firstly, there are a lot more opportunities now in various areas that prioritize ethical concerns, whether they be environmental or social, or peace issues. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. The trouble is, there's always more people looking for those paths than there are jobs in those areas. It's still a small fraction compared with, well, I say that it depends how strictly you apply your ethical considerations. Low carbon sectors are actually expanding very fast, and there are a lot of them. So that's a real opportunity. But there are all sorts of ethical issues within that. If you look at mining for critical minerals, there are major ethical issues there. Nuclear power is being promoted as a solution to climate change, but there are major problems there, and particularly the connection to nuclear weapons. So the ethical issues don't go away, but you do have to think carefully around them. And I would encourage anyone to do some reading, talk to organizations like SGR, find out more about the ethical issues, and do ask awkward questions, so that you don't find yourself in the situation that I found myself in, where you are in a job and you're going, this is really awful and I want to leave. If you can ask those questions early, then you can avoid those situations and find yourself in a much stronger position. Oh, also the other side of it is um, recognizing what your own skills and talents are and what your own interests are, and exploiting those. If you like maths, be good at maths, but make sure you think about who you're gonna sell those skills to. And you're in a much stronger position if you are a well-skilled individual. If you are someone that has sort of Yes, how do I put this? If you've been a bit lazy at school or university, you don't have a good degree, you're in a much more difficult position when it comes to pick and choosing the jobs. You would take a job where you have to compromise your ethics more because you can't get the job you want because you haven't developed your skills well enough. That can be a problem. So do be aware of that pitfall. A lot of people end up in jobs they don't like because they don't have the skills to get out of them. They don't have the skills that are more desirable. And it's sometimes, I mean, it's also important to be aware where you're kind of being pushed in one direction and actually your skills and aspirations are somewhere else. I mean, it was for the example in my case was my granddad thought you'll be good at engineering. You should go into engineering. And I kind of followed his advice and actually no, that wasn't where I wanted to be. I was much more interested in the science, the investigating problems, the mathematical modeling, computer skills that I had there, and the engineering side of things about building some of the kit was much more relevant to the military at that time or arms industries at that time, and I wasn't actually as good at that bit. So so yes, so recognizing where you were being sort of steered in a direction that didn't fit for you is also important, and that helps you find your other skills, and also recognizing skills that are not so often associated with scientists and engineers. Communication skills and science communication is a whole area of work, whether it's working for the media or working for campaign groups or working in various public relations roles. Those are where you're communicating directly to audiences or indeed teaching. Recognizing those skills and how you can use those skills is also important. And also, of course, those are also in demand by industry because they like good spokespeople to give the best picture of themselves and to gloss over the fact that they might be very polluting or developing all sorts of weapon systems which are being used in all sorts of destructive ways. So it's important to be aware of those issues as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all your experience and insights. Um, thank you.
Thank you.